Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have a very special guest back on. I think this is 4 or 5 times now at this point, Dr. Eric Helms, and also newly WNBF professional bodybuilder, Dr. Eric Helms as well too. Eric, thank you for coming back on the podcast.
It is always a pleasure, Jeff. Thank you so much.
So, like I said there, WNBF professionals, congrats on that. Super awesome. I think last time we had you on, you were like pretty deep into prep. I don't know if you had your first show yet. You might have. I'll have to look at the date here while you're talking. But yeah, congrats on that. And then I did want to spend the first little bit chatting about that. So first, yeah, congrats though.
Jeff, thank you so much. No, it's a huge honor. And I also don't honestly remember if the last time on I had competed yet. But no, it was a really good season. I started dieting, I think February 4th, and finished dieting or I finished my season, I should say. Saying dieting is a little misleading with diet breaks, peaking, all that stuff. But finished my season on November 19th, competing in the professional middleweight bodybuilding division at WNBF Worlds in Seattle. So that was 41 weeks in total for the season. And my shows were all tightly packed. I started with WNBF New Zealand on September 30th, and then, like I said, finished on the 19th of November. So that was a total of 5 shows in 7 weeks. So I did 3 back-to-back, then WNBF Australia 2 weeks later, and then 3 weeks later Worlds. So it was a whirlwind. And yeah, it actually culminated with me getting my pro card at WNBF Australia, and then getting the opportunity and the privilege, I should say, to compete in the pro class at Worlds, which is arguably the most competitive field you can step into as a natural bodybuilder. And it was a true honor and a blessing, because this is something that I've wanted since I first attended a bodybuilding show. My first one was a WNBF show back when I had just gotten out of the Air Force. My wife was still stationed, and we were living in Augusta, Georgia. She was still stationed at Fort Gordon. And I got to see the WNBF Iron Eagle in '06, I think, and thought, oh man, one day I want to be a WNBF pro. So that was 17 years ago, and I've been trying at it, and I finally did it in my 5th competitive season since my first competitive season in '07. So yeah, it's 16 years in the making, 17 years in the making. Jeez. Yeah.
It's funny, it aligns with like building muscle in general, how it's just such a slow process. Same thing with that, 16 years in the making like that. I know it's going to be different for everybody. It could be longer, it could be shorter. But either way, it just goes to show just how long you just need to be in it for the long game there. How was the feeling? I know, again, you wait that long to do it. It's something that you had set for a while. So I guess how was that? And then how was it afterwards? Because I would imagine it sounds like you got it in Australia and then you went and competed professionally. So you didn't have that period of time there to where you probably didn't get to soak it all in completely in that short time frame.
I don't know if I've still soaked it all in yet, man. That's the thing. Emotions are an interesting thing. Like, the more zigs and zags you have to get to a goal, the more that amplifies the goal achievement experience. It's a strange analogy, but if you hang with me, it sucks to lose a loved one. You feel this intense sense of grief, but one of the ways that I found helps process that is reminding myself that the grief I feel is inverse to the love I felt for the person and the value of our relationship. While it is a momentous thing to get that kind of success in any sport, I think when it happens to someone their very first season, and they happen to either they delayed their decision to compete for a long time, or they just stumbled upon the sport, more so if they just stumbled upon it, or if they're just a genetic phenom. Not to say that it's all genetics, of course. There's a lot of hard work that goes into winning a pro card, whether you do it in your first season or your 5th, like in my case. But I think there probably is a little more meaning that comes from the experience when you have been grinding away and away at it. When in 2009 was the first season I did INBF, WNBF shows, and I got into 2 overalls without winning the overall title and getting the pro card. And then I also placed second in my class to the gentleman who ended up going on to win his pro card in '09. And then I had a very similar experience in 2019, when I came back after my PhD, and took another run at the WNBF, the coveted WNBF pro card. And I placed second in 2 shows, and then also won an INBF WNBF show that could have been a pro qualifier if there'd been enough people attending. That was and that was just the last couple of years. And then this season, the reason I did 5 shows was because it took me that many tries to get my pro card, or at least the first 4. So I've been a top amateur for a long time in the WNBF, and I've even been able to get pro status back in the day in a smaller organization and a smaller show. To get this specific outcome, it's the hardest pro card to get in natural bodybuilding. So it's, in my opinion. And so, yeah, it was an intensely emotional experience for me. And it was very difficult to keep it together on stage. And off stage, I absolutely did not, nor did I even try to keep it together. I let myself feel that. And yeah, it was a very mixed bag of emotions. I think I didn't realize the degree to which I had imposter syndrome and insecurity, and maybe even though part of me was striving for this goal and putting in the work continually, never thought I would actually get here. So I think when you dare to hope, but part of you is never really thinking that you're actually going to get there, when you arrive at the goal, it's almost bewildering because you're like, oh, like I said I was shooting for the stars and hoping to get for the moon, but realistically, I never thought I'd get out of the atmosphere. So then when you are on the moon and you're like, oh shit, like I am out of the atmosphere. Now all of a sudden there's this, for me at least, there was this pressure that went away. And all that was left is a lot of the positive motivators to compete without much of the self-doubt remaining at all. And I'm sure that's going to be a continual process, but right now I'm really motivated like I haven't been in years. Not that I have ever missed workouts or I've ever cheated on my diet or anything like that, but there's a difference between doing your job and then just chomping at the bit to constantly, oh man, like it's an off day. This is a terrible day. I can't wait to work out tomorrow. It feels very much like I have the wisdom of being the experienced competitor I have, but now the drive I had in my first off season after my first competitive season again. So I'm now trying to see if I can be competitive in the pro ranks. I placed seventh out of nine in the middleweights in the pros, which is I was ecstatic with. I didn't place last, which means I beat a couple pros, which means I belong on that stage, which was awesome. And now I'm trying to see if I can make the improvements necessary to place top five. And like I said, since I'm already beyond where I thought I'd ever stand, it's I can't be disappointed, but I can really be excited about what's possible because I think the fact that I've achieved a far better physique than I ever thought possible and been rewarded for it makes me think that there is more possible. And yeah, I'm pushing real hard at it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And yeah, just cool to hear your emotions and everything like that around it. Just because, again, I know that for some people, they work so hard for that and it's now they're there and it's okay, now what? But again, you have that motivation to keep going. And I want to back up a little bit and I do want to come back to what's next for you coming up and your off season and then your next competitive season, your first professional competitive season. So to go back to your prep. So I just looked, our last episode was in August, so we probably chatted in July, the nitty gritty time there. What was there anything that you did like different in that, like in the final 8 weeks or so? And then was there anything that you specifically really tried to work on in that final 8 weeks? Can you still hear me? Sorry, it says it went off. Okay. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can still hear you, but it
Okay.
definitely shifted from one mic to probably your computer mic.
Crap, my Yeti went off.
Yeah, I can tell it went off, but it's
I'm gonna
not,
pause.
I can still understand you.
I'm gonna pause this just real quick. Yeah. So was there anything that you felt like you did differently this time around that maybe got you to that pro status? And just, yeah, maybe what the final 8 weeks look like leading up to the shows?
I think there were things that I didn't do in the final 8 weeks that helped me get to pro status, but the majority of what I did that I think helped me get my pro card was done in the off season. So I'll explain what both of those are. We definitely tried to pace this season so that I had preserved as much willpower and mental and physiological reserve, if you will, as possible. So that means not digging too hard. That means pacing ourselves and trying to maintain performance in the gym, sleep, physiological function, and then just keeping a really tight eye on what's an appropriate level of fatigue. And that's something that's very difficult to do without experience or without a coach. And I fortunately had both on my side. Alberto Nunez has helped me through this prep and every single prep I've done since '09. Because when you really dig to get shredded, and the opposite thing that really should be done that most competitors do is they try to accelerate the efforts towards fat loss as they get closer and closer because sometimes they get behind. Sometimes it's just out of this fear of not being lean enough because the conditioning standard's so high. Sometimes it's chasing scale weight that is just being weird and fluctuating because you're constipated, retaining water because you're fatigued, doing a lot of cardio, not recovering your muscle damage as well. or just getting in your own head. We could have, for example, and I think if I'd ran my prep on my own, I could have pushed harder to get leaner for my very first show. And my very first show, which I actually won, we came in full and lean enough. Obviously, I did well, but could have potentially been tighter. Maybe I could have gotten my pro card at that show based upon the panel if I'd been a little tighter. That was some of the feedback they gave. And I don't think it's worth getting into that, but the way that small international affiliates of the WNBF decide pro card status is different than the US because they're trying to build up their pro ranks. So early on, when there's not enough athletes in the show to award pro cards based upon the same rules in the US, where you have to have X number of competitors in there to award a pro card, they have a panel, which may be international that's watching live stream, or it may be physically there if there's a robust enough judging panel that's been established in that country. And they decide if the person who won the potential pro card is at pro worthy level. And at that first show, they thought, hey, we've seen you leaner, Eric. We want to see you at a higher standard if we're going to award you a pro card. So I could have potentially pushed harder and gotten that initial return on investment, but I don't know if I then would have survived all the way to Worlds that many weeks later because it's difficult to be in peak shape. And so I'm actually pretty pleased with the path we took where I hit peak condition at the show where I won my pro card, as well as at Worlds, where I needed to belong and be at my best against the pro class. So anyway, that was the one thing that I could have done differently in prep that I'm glad I didn't do differently, which was a sprint to the finish rather than pacing myself. And I think it's part of the reason why I feel so well recovered right now. And I'm only, say, 9, 10 pounds over stage weight a month post show. So that's a really good sign. That means that when you really crush yourself in a contest season, typically you see a huge weight rebound. It's very difficult not to binge eat. And even with that huge surplus and gaining a lot of weight, it still takes time to recover physiologically. You're dealing with how lean did you get? How hard did you push your calories down? For how long? And then what was the psychological toll that it all took? And recovery has to take into account all of those. So I kept my psychological toll the lowest it's ever been out of all 5 seasons. I was good to go days after the show, honestly, beforehand, because I was able to eat up into the show. In terms of leanness, it was the leanest I've ever been. So I had to put on body fat. And in terms of the deficit, it got low, but I certainly pushed myself harder. And like I said, I had about 10 days eating at roughly maintenance before the show even my final show of the season happened. So I already quote unquote reversed and I could just get right into recovery. So that process went really well, and it's now set me up for a fantastic off season, which is good because if you over or undershoot your recovery, you're losing valuable time, which you just don't have as a natural athlete, like you stated. If you get too heavy, you're forcing yourself to diet in the off season. And if you are too tight and restrictive and come out with almost this disordered eating where I'm trying to stay shredded year round, you're spinning your wheels because it's very difficult to make muscle gain progress when you're too lean. So that's in prep what I did right. But truly, what enabled me to win a pro card was the changes I made in the offseason because I did a really good job in 2019 as well. I got just about as lean as I was at my pro card win, if not as lean in the shows I did, and was able to eat up, preserved a lot of willpower, and had a very similarly good season. It's a marginal improvement in terms of the process. But what you could see, and I posted about this on my Instagram, is that key muscle groups that really improved my symmetry were not as good as they were this year. Specifically, having more capped delts and also having fuller upper lats and back, which finally gave me kind of the symmetry and X frame that I need as a very tall competitor with a relatively narrow frame. And I put some side by side front lat spreads up from the WNBF New Zealand show I did next to the 2 shows that I did in California in the INBF, one the River City and then one the Mayhem. And you can see that I have the symmetry in this X frame that's much more pleasing just with these relatively subtle changes to my delts and lats that really brought my whole physique together. So it's just an example of how small changes can make a big difference. And what I did to achieve that was basically for all of my off season leading into 2023. So all of 2022 or almost all of it, I was doing a specialization cycle for my lats and delts and also calves, and they improved, but nobody cared. And also just continuously, I've been doing far more volume and work on my upper body than my lower, just to because I was historically bottom heavy, which I am no longer. I have to take a different tact for my my first pro off season, but that is what I think really enabled me to get the pro card in the first place.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I like your points there about how, because a lot of times I think people, they really, whether you're just getting lifestyle lean or stage lean, I feel like they do, everyone really, I think it's a well-known thing that people do struggle in that period of time afterwards. And I think people really worry about that. But I think, like you said there, it's also what you do ahead of time that can really set you up for that post-period time there. And I think people maybe don't really think about that. And I think I'm glad that you're able to talk through that. And I like too, it made me realize too, how for you specifically, and again, whether this is somebody who's lifestyle lean going from a fat loss phase to a building phase or a gaining phase, like, if you can manage that period of time afterwards, you're going to set yourself up for more productive runway of training and whatnot there. Whether, like you said, if you undershoot it, then you're going to be too lean and it's going to be hard to make progress. But then also on the flip side, if you gain too much, now you're have more body fat and that's probably going to decrease your runway there. Really interesting stuff. I love that. And then one thing you mentioned was the specialization phase. What did that kind of look like? I know, again, that goes even further back to your off season, but what kind of made it a specialization phase there?
Great question. And this is super, super individualized. This is not general advice, but maybe insight into what it takes to get specific individualized progress when you're dealing with bodybuilding athletes who are at a higher level, and not necessarily a higher level compared to others, but compared to their own potential. So sometime around 2011, it became very apparent that a balanced program for me was not producing a balanced physique. And just by me competing, as I always have, in strength sport and bodybuilding, with similar volumes for, say, the big three and all my muscle groups, my legs were very dominant. I was bottom heavy, and I didn't have equivalent mass top to bottom, so my symmetry was off. So 2011, I started doing more dedicated training in the off season of that competitive year, starting in like late 2011 and into 2012, more volume relative to my lower body from my upper body. And I basically put my lower body on maintenance. And I just let powerlifting, strongman weightlifting, the things I've variously done, which has a lot of course, lower body dominant movements, a lot of squat patterns and deadlift patterns, take care of my lower body. So I started training my upper body at least 3 times a week and basically getting to the point where I was doing double the volume of my lower body. And that kind of peaked to where in 2018, my off season before my 2019 season, I shifted to what's popularly described as like a 5-day full body system, but it's not really full body. Basically, all 5 days I'm doing some upper body training, and then I'm sprinkling the small amount of lower body volume I need between those 5 days. And that improved my symmetry, but it didn't get it to where it needed to be. So then in 2022, I was really assessing what held me back in 2019, and it was my X frame. So I specifically then took that approach where I was doing 5 days of some upper body training. Some days looked a lot more upper body. A couple days looked more like most of a lower body with a couple upper body things. So for example, I might have an RDL leg press and then a lat and a shoulder exercise and 2 arm exercises. What is that? Is that full body? No. Like I didn't train my chest, didn't train my calves, but it's hard to describe it otherwise. And anyway, I took that system of those 5 days where basically it's just me distributing my volume and the stimulus in such a way to allow maximum recovery, minimal overlap, and getting between 6 to 12 sets for my lower body muscles, except for calves, which were getting a lot more, and then more in the range of, say, 15 to 20 sets for my upper body. Maybe more like 12 to 20 at this time. And on top of that, what I then did was, all right, I'm going to start every one of these 5 sessions with 4 sets on medial delts, or middle delts, I should say, and then 4 sets on lats, and then 4 sets on calves. So this kicked my calf volume up to 20 sets per week. I didn't do additional calf work after that. I just swapped that out, and it brought my lat and my delt volume into the mid 20 to 30 sets. And I wish I could say that I'm happy that worked with 100%. Yeah, everything about that's great. I'm really glad it did work. Obviously, I wouldn't undo it because I got my pro card and it was successful. But it reiterated that at least the solution for Eric Helms is if I want certain muscle groups to grow, at least that are above the waist and above the knee, and below the knee, excuse me. But I have to do more work more frequently and harder. There's no special sauce. I don't think that's completely true because another thing I did was incorporate more exercises that are probably optimized for hypertrophy. So I wasn't like I was adding dumbbell lateral raises. I was adding like cable lateral raises to make sure there was tension when the muscle was at the longest point. And I did things like cross body cable lateral raises. So starting with one hand in my opposite pocket or behind the back lateral raises. So the hand at the opposite side glute behind me so that there's again, tension being applied in the most stretched position possible. And then doing things like single arm pull downs, trying to get into a more elongated position, stretch the lat, pulling across my body, and taking some of these concepts that are both being developed in the applied aspects of bodybuilding specific programming, as well as the research that's emerging, showing that training at longer muscle lengths seems to enhance hypertrophy. And I think those two things, basically doing a lot more, but also more efficiently, and also training closer to failure and more frequently, what was the key. So I spent the better part of 2022 doing that. And yeah, I'm not going to tell everyone that the key to bringing up your physique is do 30 sets to failure for a given muscle group and train it every day you come into the gym. But I think sometimes that is the solution. More often than not, it is enhancing things like the mind muscle connection, getting a more honest assessment of your proximity to failure, and having more organization and structure and effort and technical quality to your training, and then making sure that your nutritional lifestyle supports it. But I had already done those things, considering that was sufficient to bring up my upper body, but not to get me the level of development that I needed in those specific muscle groups, which interestingly enough, my lats and my delts weren't necessarily small or underdeveloped. It was that sitting on my skeletal frame, they weren't as big as they needed to be to provide the overall look. Because if you looked at my side chest or my side tricep, no one would say, hey, your delts are too small. They would even say, well, you have pretty big delts, maybe you could bring up your arms. But when you turn me into a front relaxed or a front lat spread, now because of my rib cage size and my clavicle width, I just wasn't coming out farther enough relative to my waist. And just getting another few inches of width really did make a big difference in those poses. And that's what it required of me.
Yeah, that's awesome. So yeah, just really focused on, like you said, just increasing the volume a little bit, making sure you trained it more frequently, prioritized it. And I guess with that, did the volume stay the same throughout, or was that something that you started out a little bit lower and then added and found what was the sweet spot there? Or what, yeah, what did that look like?
Yeah, I did it incrementally because I didn't want to necessarily just blow myself up all at once. I started with about 3 sets per muscle group and I wasn't training to failure. So I was doing lats, delts, calves to start 3 sets and training at around 8 or 9 RPE or 1 to 2 RIR. And then just seeing how I responded. And I wasn't getting sore. I wasn't feeling under recovered. So I pushed it up to 4 sets and then I started pushing it. So that last set was hitting failure. And then I was starting to get a little bit sore, but then I adapted to that. And it wasn't, and like, it's not to say that I wasn't sometimes sore in my lats or my calves, rarely my delts going into the next training session, but it wasn't to the level that I think anyone would be like, oh man, that's a sign that you're not recovered on time. And my performance was also going up as slow as it does on these kind of isolation movements. And visually, I thought I was seeing improvements, and even in the off season, which became more readily apparent as I got leaner and leaner in my 2023 prep. So I would advise people to do this incrementally. If I was to say, hey, here's what you should do to someone else, I would say the first step is to get some assessment of your form. Get someone you trust, a coach, and they want to look at, are you actually targeting the given muscle that you're trying to hit? And some ways that you can assess that objectively are not that it's a proxy for growth, but it does tell you if you trained it, are you getting DOMs where you're trying to train in subsequent days? If you're not, and you've actually increased the stimulus, not necessarily through doing more sets or training to failure, but just getting a better mind muscle connection. So if you can feel it during training and you're getting a little sore the next day, especially when you're initially making these changes, that indicates that you are actually targeting that muscle group. Even though the muscle damage is not what's necessarily causing the growth, it does tell you where the tension is being applied. Yeah, the mind muscle connection during training, the initial DOMs afterwards, key components to give you that feedback as to whether you're training the right muscle group. And then in terms of assessing that technical aspect, you also want to make sure that the RPE or the proximity to failure that you think you're at, you're actually at. You can do things like training to a 2 RIR and then keep going. And if you can get 4 more reps, like, oh, okay, you're being a little too conservative. If you only get 1 more, okay, you're being a little too aggressive, but that's still pretty good. If you're within a 1 rep of what you think you're at, that's a pretty reasonable range, right? And yeah, and even getting other people to assess that. send a video of your training to some more experienced folks who have a good eye for this, trainers who you trust, fellow competitors, just fellow, workout partner, people who aren't just yes men or women, and they can give you that feedback and go, yeah, I think you're holding back a little bit, or yeah, that might have been more like a 5 RIR than an 8, because that can definitely be, if that has never been, that stone hasn't been turned over, it's worth trying, especially on certain muscle groups like the lats and the delts specifically. I think not only are they structurally important for me just because the way I'm built skeletally, but I think as someone who has been a relatively strict exerciser in terms of my form, the biomechanics of back and delt exercises with the way they're traditionally performed make that a bad combination. So if I only count a rep as when I can get that row, like the bar or the dumbbell or the cable attachment to touch my upper abdomen, and that if the last rep I can do where it touches is considered a 10 RPE or a 0 RIR, and that's when I stop the set, and I'm not always even training to failure, that means because these exercises for the back are so much harder when you're moving towards the shortened position and finishing the movement, that you're limiting yourself based upon the least stimulative portion of that range of motion. What we've learned from research on this is that when the muscle is in a more stretched position, tension is higher, or at least the stimulus is higher. But that's the easiest portion of most back exercises. Like the reason why people don't come all the way up on chin ups, for example, is because that's really hard to go from the bar at the top of your forehead to your chin. It's disproportionately hard. And that's fine for a strength goal or performance goal. Like I want to be able to do 20 chin over bar strict pull-ups because I want to be just as cool as a US Marine or something like that. But from a hypertrophy standpoint, it's actually the first half of that range of motion where the lat is much more elongated, which is more stimulative. Doing things like saying, you know what, I'm going to call a 10 RPE when I can no longer do half of that range of motion, a 10 RPE. And this can apply to other exercises like a hamstring curl or a calf raise, things where it is that shortened peak, quote unquote, contraction, which make feel really hard, but it's actually not that great from a hypertrophy standpoint and can limit what you can do, where I think that becomes important. Things like the delts are like that as well, where you're traditionally performing a dumbbell lateral raise as your primary way of training the middle delts. And because the lever arm is only challenged once it's further from the fulcrum at peak extension, or I should say peak flexion, or I guess it's abduction, that's the point where the delta is shortest. So if you switch to a cable and then even accentuate the stretch by reaching across your body or behind your back, now all of a sudden you're providing what for many people might be a novel stimulus and a level of intensity, quote unquote, that they have never experienced. And that was definitely the case for me when I started doing partial range of motion, single arm lat pull downs, reaching across, and really focusing on getting a stretch in the lat and a stretch in the delt, and then training to that new definition of failure where I want to at least get halfway and doing things like lengthened partials. All of a sudden, for the first time in a decade, my lats and my delts started getting sore. And I was like, oh, I see what's happening here. There was that feedback quite quickly, better pumps and performance increases. At first, I could lift very, like I wasn't that strong in these new challenging positions. And then rapidly, I started to see strength improvements. And then eventually, there was the proof in the pudding in my physique. So I think there is a combination of factors there: structural, biomechanics, history, and then my individual genetics, to where it seems like my lower body is just very happy, at least my quads and my hamstrings, to grow from just a couple of sets of squats and deadlifts or movements like that.
Yeah, mine's the same way. Like I did a couple natural bodybuilding shows years ago, and some of the feedback I got was like, hey, you need your upper body to match your lower body. So I resonated when you said that. And really since then I've done the same type of thing where it's just I've definitely prioritized the upper body overall versus the lower body, just because I'm the same way, where it's just a little bit of stimulus seems to be enough, at least to maintain, and it's a tiny amount there, which is nice. I know that, like looking back when I did my bro splits and was more of a bro, I'm still a bro now, but more of a bro when it came to training, that was a perfect, hey, I don't have to train legs very often. That's freaking awesome. So I can definitely relate to that. And same thing with the back training and the delt training. Like that's been super helpful to incorporate some of those length and partials there with that. So again, that was what you did ahead of time, right? Like a lot of times, again, people, same thing with the fat going from the show to afterwards. Like you set yourself up for success afterwards. And same thing there. You set yourself up for a good prep by what you did in the off season as well too. It's not necessarily anything that you did then. It was what you did in the previous off season there. So what about, yeah, so I guess we'll now go from, okay, that was we went way back. I guess to go back to your first show, professional show, how was that? And then I guess we can go into what's next for you and what your game plan is there around that.
Yeah, no, the pro show was awesome. It felt different going into it because going into all four of the pro qualifiers that I was trying to get my pro card at, there was a level of obviously controlled anxiety, but also anxiety as it goes hand in hand with excitement, right? Because there's something on the line. And in 2023, more than any other season, except for maybe my first couple, I dared to be a shark in the water. I vocally announced that I have all these intrinsic reasons for competing, and I compete for myself, and it is still about the journey and dedication, desire, and discipline, our company mission statement, and my whole philosophy. But I also am a competitive person, and I have competitive aspirations, and I want to see how far I can take myself, and then see where that puts me in the arena. And I'm coming to do battle. So each time when you are coming to do battle with that mindset, rather than just trying to beat your former version of yourself, there's more on the line, and it feels different. There was pressure, not bad pressure, but good pressure, and there was risk associated with these first four shows. And I knew that I would feel bad to some degree when I didn't get the outcome I wanted. Not that it would supersede the fact that I brought my best physique to the stage of all time each time I competed this year, which is truly the most successful season one can have. In my first show, I wasn't at my peak levels of leanness, but even then, it was a better physique than I ever brought. So that told me, hey, your off season went really well. You're definitely lean enough. And then as I got leaner, I just kept being my best, and I was peaking well each time and improving upon my peak. That culminating in the external reward of getting my pro card and also getting to win that show in New Zealand was awesome. But once I turned pro, all of a sudden that pressure went away. There was a little bit just to look like I belonged on the pro stage, but it already feel like I'd won. Like someone has to place last. I truly don't think I would have been that disappointed if I'd placed 9 out of 9 at WNBF Worlds. It would have just told me I have more work to do. And I think, yeah, I might have had a little bit of hesitation. Oh, am I really pro worthy if I place last? But honestly, when I looked at that lineup and I saw the video and I saw who I was going up against, the first through ninth, all of them are impressive bodybuilders. So if you look at any one of these people by themselves in the pro middleweights, pro lightweights, or pro heavyweights at WNBF Worlds, they're incredible. These are people who have won pro cards. They have won the overall typically at other shows or placed very high in very big shows. They're often one of the best amateurs in their country, or they're an overall winner if they came from the States. They all looked amazing, and it was a privilege to be up there. And to place seventh out of ninth, I think maybe a seasoned pro who has always been super focused on winning and maybe didn't have the same, I don't know, history that I did of trying to fight his way up the ranks would have been disappointed with that, placing in the bottom quartile. But for me, that was awesome. Seventh in the world that year, right? It's mind-blowing to me. And I felt like just like getting to the Olympics was the achievement. So there was zero pressure going in, and I felt such gratitude, and it was an amazing experience, and it was a very different feeling. And I think moving forward, it is going to feel different because there's a lot more flexibility as a pro athlete in natural bodybuilding. You choose, oh, when do I want to compete? Where? What do I enter? And they are smaller shows that are much more competitive. You're typically competing against 4 to at Worlds as many as in the teens, like the lightweight class at 16. But to compete in Worlds, you have to do a pro show to qualify for it, except for your rookie pro season. So once you turn pro, then that year you compete at Worlds. So moving forward, I'm going to be probably competing less frequently so I can actually spend some time building and improving on my physique, and then doing a qualifying show sometime in like September, October, and then going back to Worlds to see, okay, can I crack that top 5, which is the next goal for me. So it felt very different, no pressure, and mostly just gratitude and a desire to represent myself well. And then to see the shots and the video, I brought my best physique of all time to the WNBF Pro World stage. I was at my leanest. I was at my most symmetrical. I posed really well, which I spent a lot of time practicing and working on. And a big shout out to Jeff Alberts, who helped me make those changes to represent myself well. And it was the most balanced I've ever been. So I looked at myself and I went, yeah, the biggest knock on me is I'm just too tall to be a middleweight. I just need to be bigger if I'm going to walk in there at 6 foot. Ideally, I should probably be a heavyweight, but I just don't know if it's realistic for me to put, 10 pounds of muscle on my stage weight at this stage of the game. However, to answer the second part of your question, like, what do I need to do now? The funny thing is, now that I'm symmetrical, now that I'm balanced, I got to bring everything up. So I've got some leg days back on the docket for the first time in like 12 years. I have one pure leg day. That's my day 4 of my now 5-day split. And I have one leg day where I do arms afterwards. So my split now, which Brian Miner, one of the 3DMJ coaches who I'm now working on with in the off season, to be like that objective eye, and we're collaborating together. We've set it up so I have 5 days. So day 1 is basically upper body except for arms. Day 2 is legs plus arms. Then I have day 3 off. Day 4, my third training day, is upper body with arms to some degree. And then day 5, or so my fourth training day, 5th day of the week, is a pure lower body day. And then 6th day, 5th training day is shoulders and arms, basically. And then I have a day off. So I've got 2 off days and 5 training days per week with 2 almost pure leg days. And my lower body volume is almost doubled from what it was, but it's also coming exclusively from bodybuilding style training. So I've gone monogamous. I'm not doing powerlifting or strength sport anymore. And that's not to say that I don't love them or that I won't ever come back to them. But it's just that at this stage of the game, knowing what I need to do, I really have to, if I want to fill my cup for bodybuilding, I really have to specialize after 19 years of lifting. I finally hit that point. Yeah, I don't have barbell squats or barbell deadlifts, at least the like conventional or sumo. I have RDLs, I've got hack squats, I've got leg press, I've got Bulgarian split squats, but I don't have back squats or sumo or conventional. And I have a flat back medium close grip bench press ish, but I don't have barbell bench. And that's the first time I haven't done the big 3 in my program for honestly ever, for more than just a mesocycle where I took time off because of injury or something like that. So I'm really excited to see what I can do with this. And yeah, overall, basically now I just have, it's a grow everything program with just the specifications that Eric Helms needs, which is higher volume on the upper body and a little more emphasis on like back width, back thickness, and like the t-shirt muscles, but also really trying to bring up my glutes and my quads as well, which were identified as being a little under compared to the pro lineup.
So it sounds like from that standpoint, you're not necessarily like evening out the volume on everything. It's just now you're maybe, for example, your legs, you had closer to like maintenance for a while. Now that volume's a little bit higher there with that. Did you decrease the volume at all on like your delts and back, or is that you still going to try to maintain that, or did you have to bring that down a little bit?
No, yeah. So I would say basically we're not doing a specialization for delt. The one thing I'm not doing is specializing my calves anymore. My calves grew. Everyone agreed that they looked better. It just didn't matter from a physique perspective. And the amount of time sink that they will have to get even better than that is I'm uncertain that they will get bigger, and I don't think it will matter. So it's just, we're good. I don't have good calves, but we're good. But yeah, like I got coaches' feedback. I have my first vlog episode of Believe 2024, my pro off season on the 3D Muscle Journey YouTube. And the feedback I got from the 5 coaches, or say the 4 coaches besides me, if you look at what they all said, basically it's everything. Like my biceps, my calves, and my abs are the only things not specifically mentioned that need to come up. So it's just, when you get in the pros and you're balanced, you need to be bigger. And that's the feedback I got from judges as well. Exactly right. We're now moving to use Mike Israetel's volume landmarks as to try to understand something. I was at my minimum effective, I'm not even going to say volume, dose for my lower body, sans calves, and I was at an adaptive level of volume for my upper body with a specific focus on delts and lats. And now I would say that I am at an adaptive stimulus for the entirety of my body, except for like my calves and my abs and my biceps. And I do think my biceps might grow a little bit just because of the amount of pulling I'm doing. And I'm still training them for 7 direct sets per week on top of all of the indirect work. To give people an idea, if you count direct and indirect sets, most of my upper body is in the 20 to 30 set range right now.
Awesome. Yeah. And then I guess too, so obviously focusing on the training, is there anything, I guess, from a training or nutrition standpoint that you're really going to focus on, or is it just, hey, just a small surplus? Yeah. And anything, any other like training techniques or anything that you're going to potentially try to implement during this off season?
Yeah, a big thing I think is exercise order. When you're putting forth high efforts and a fair amount of volume, you really can get more bang from your buck with what you place earlier in a session. I think that is one of the main downsides to people chasing very high volumes is that the quality of the session rapidly decreases.
Yeah.
And as time goes on, that can get exacerbated as you start to quote unquote go through the motions. When you're programming the way we are and trying to get to these levels of volume, you have to really think about the proximity to failure pairing with the exercise order. And then how do you manage time and manage psychological effort? So that was a large part of the reason why Brian wanted to give me 5 days instead of, say, 6, which was my initial plan, because I was just trying to spread it out even more so that no individual day was too fatiguing. But I think having the recovery is also important, and then doing things where we have a day where I come in and I start with a back movement or start with a chest movement or start with leg movements, right? Since those have to come up as well. And then thinking what's realistic that I can that I can do when I have a leg day. Because leg days, of course, are those very challenging days. So there's a reason why on my one leg day, pure leg day, where I do RDL, hack squat, leg extension, leg curl, calf raise, that's all I'm doing. While on the other leg day, we're going, okay, we'll just do three arm exercises afterwards, and we'll choose slightly easier movements like a leg press, a seated leg curl, and a calf raise and a back extension. They're things that will be hard in aggregate, and a Bulgarian split squat, but none of them individually are really going to blow you out like an RDL or a hack squat can when you're pushing. I don't have any RPEs in my program below 8, so it's a lot of volume close to failure. And that means you have to be really strategic about how you do it. So frequency becomes important, exercise order becomes important. And I think the message to people is that you want to pair the right rep range and RPE with given movements. So for example, the leg press is a moderate rep range. It's 5 to 8. And the RPE is starting at an 8 and getting to no higher than a 9. Because if you kick off leg press doing 15 reps at a 10 RPE, everything else is going to suffer just because of the effort you have to put forth. But we also know that doing moderately heavy loads for moderate reps that are still in the hypertrophy bottom end of that rep range, not to failure, should be just as effective, but can really reduce the discomfort and psychological fatigue. So I think that's something that a lot of bodybuilders miss, and sometimes they chase hard rather than they chase effective. And that can start to create bottlenecks when you have to do high amounts of work to grow. Yeah, it's badass to do 3 by 20 on a compound leg exercises, and you'll feel an extreme sense of accomplishment and it'll make you see God, but it will also prevent everything else you do that for that session after that exercise, and maybe even the next 2 to 3 days from being at the level of quality and effort that you can put forth, and it may increase the frequency that you need to deload. So those things are just not worth it to me, where I don't have to prove spiritually to myself that I'm a hard worker or a bodybuilder anymore. I've done that. Like I've carved out the bottom of my barrel and shown myself that I can push myself to the extremes to the point past efficiency. And now I'm much more interested in what's effective and results rather than proving things to myself for at least most of the time, right? I'm no longer interested in showing the world that I'm a hard worker. I'm interested in doing what makes the most sense because I have to if I want to progress at this stage. If it took me 19 years of training to get a pro card, then I've got to do something really efficient, smart, and really milk everything that's left and not leave any stone unturned if I want to move from the guy who's killed himself to get 7th out of 9th on a pro stage to the guy who, before he's 60, is going to try to crack the top 5 and maybe even in my 40s. I'm actually very hopeful, though, despite how tall of an order that sounds. I think the fact that I have not seriously trained my legs on purpose for 12 years means that they probably have a lot of growth potential. And I'm also very interested in applying a lot of the things that I've learned that help my delts and lats improve to the majority of my upper body. And I think by removing the need of trying to improve as a power lifter or a strength athlete and bodybuilder simultaneously,
Yeah.
I've removed some bottlenecks that allow for that. I'm doing more work at a higher intensity, but I don't feel as beat up as I did when I was doing less work, but having the requirement to include the squat, bench, and the deadlift relatively heavy on a relatively frequent basis.
Yeah, and that all makes sense. And because one of my thoughts was like, okay, so if you're gonna, I feel like when you are trying to build muscle, people will ask, should you go to failure all the time? Should you do higher volumes, things like that? And there's just so many things that go into that. It's hard to just say you should do more volume, you should train to failure. For example, the volume, you're like, hey, I need to figure out how to get the most productive volume out of this. And I think it comes down to, like you said, just being smart with, hey, you know when to push certain exercises, like for leg press, for example, in order to get an effective stimulus. You don't necessarily have to go to absolute failure on that. It's being smart with the rep range, being smart with your how close you're getting to failure. And then that's going to allow you to be able to do more productive training overall. And then, like you mentioned too, not doing powerlifting, like you're not going to be doing those big lifts that again aren't necessarily bad, but when you're trying to build as much muscle as possible, those are probably not going to be the best way to get as much volume in as possible there with that. And so that's a way how you can like work within these constraints and how you can have more recovery by being smarter with how you're training. And this again, I feel like where probably a lot of people are like, I don't need to focus on that stuff. You just need to train hard. And again, I feel like that's probably where that can go, that can lead you astray and whatnot there. What about on the surplus side of things? I think this will be a good segue into your weight gain study. What does that look like for you now that you are a pro? Does that change? I'm curious to hear about that side of things.
Yeah, I think it comes down to thinking about how much time do you have before you're planning to compete next, and then historically, what are the aspects of your individual psychology and physiology as to where you can be and operate in a anabolic environment. Essentially, we're just muscle farmers, right? So you're trying to get the right amount of sunlight, not too high of winds. You're trying to be in the right humidity. You want the right soil, and you want to put the right grow down, and you want to choose the right crop for the right arid or desert or tropical environment you're in, right? So the equivalent of that is trying to figure out what size of a surplus can I sustain and fits with my lifestyle and my current body fat level, or potentially maybe not even a surplus if early enough in my career, if I'm regaining tissue because of an injury that I laid off, or if I have really high body fat, so I don't even think I need a surplus. I can gain muscle while just eating at maintenance and recomping. All of those things are the same question. And then other stuff related to nutrition of nutrient timing, macronutrient breakdown. Am I taking creatine, et cetera, right? All this stuff is the same things philosophically that a farmer's thinking about to maximize crop output, right? So where that interacts for a competitive bodybuilder is that unfortunately, we are forced to do the things that are exactly counterproductive to building muscle. If you were to take the most muscular looking person on a natural bodybuilding stage you can find, because they're the leanest, they're the biggest, they look amazing, they're shredded, and you were to do like hormonal testing on them, ask them about their sleep, their anxiety levels, and how their training's been going, it is all the things you would not want to grow muscle, right? I'm only sleeping 4 hours at night. I'm highly stressed. My cortisol levels are through the roof. My testosterone is that as if I'd been castrated, and I have all the signs of relative energy deficiency in sport. So you go, oh God, how do we fix that? The way you fix that is you put back on body fat and you eat more food than you need. And then even then, you're probably going to be at best regaining lost tissue that it took you to get to that point, muscle, rather than actually putting on new muscle. So each person has a settling point or a lower intervention point to where physiologically and psychologically, and they may not be exactly the same point for both, to where they can stay in terms of their body fat percentage. And what I've learned and what I've developed over 19 years of lifting is that I'm actually a naturally relatively skinny guy. Like I used to run around with abs, and when I started training, I was 6 foot, somewhere between 165, 175 pounds, just depending upon what was I doing lately. And I didn't think about eating at all, right? I was probably always walking around between 10 to 14% body fat at most. So people who see me in the off season historically, where I've been eating big to get big and getting as heavy as like 220 pounds, but only competing at 175, they might assume, and actually Dave McConey said this to me, oh, I always assumed you're like an endo meso. And I'm like, nah, man, I'm actually, if we were to use these inaccurate classifications, but I'm more of a, like an ectometh. What I've seen over the course of my competitive careers is through the first 4 seasons of me competing, I started my prep lighter and lighter, even though my stage weight was slowly going up. So the traditional kind of bodybuilding wisdom did not really serve me as someone who is a drug-free, small-framed, 6-foot competitor who is naturally lean. This off season, I'm exploring, okay, how lean can I stay? And that has to do with like, how food focused am I? What do I need to feel fully recovered after the contest prep? And then taking on a slow rate of weight gain. Because what we can go from the research, and now we can shift to the study I've done, is that for at least for advanced lifters, for relatively well-trained lifters, the main things that you want is to actually ensure you are in a surplus, because we have data that a deficit is counterproductive, obviously, to muscle gain. But the size of the surplus doesn't seem to provide that much of an advantage, maybe a small advantage, but it's really dependent upon how effective your training is. But that's not necessarily the case for intermediates and definitely not for novices. And we also have plenty of data showing that body recomposition is a real and very normal phenomenon, especially in those who are higher in body fat or who are retraining or who are relatively novice. They're pretty far from their ceiling for gain. So any stimulus is going to result in a pretty large, robust growth response, even when there's counterproductive signals there, being in a slight deficit or not being at maintenance, because man, they're going to grow off anything because they're relatively new to the game. So for me, what this looks like is right now, the game plan is to be fully recovered by the end of the month. It's December 21st where I'm recording. So I've got another few days and to be around 84 kilos, which for those who don't speak kilos, that's like 185, right? So it's about 10 pounds over stage weight. And I'm there right now, and my weigh-ins have been in the 84s this week. And I'm feeling tremendously better. Am I fully recovered? I'm probably like 90, 95%. I'm a little too concerned with my food and too interested in the way things taste. And like I'm choosing smaller spoons when I eat yogurt because I want to take more bites. That's not like that takes time to go away after a 41-week contest prep and staying shredded for basically from July. I was single digit body fat all the way to I'm probably still single digit body fat to be honest. So that takes time, and it's difficult to tell whether it is a time issue, a surplus size issue, or energy availability issue, or a body fat issue. And all three of them coalesce into this gestalt, are you recovered? So I think the time component, I haven't had enough time out of that deficit, even though I did a very good job. It's going to take a little more. I know that my energy availability is appropriate because I've been gaining weight, and the amount I'm eating and what I brought my step count down to is appropriate. It wasn't initially, and I was being too conservative, and I bumped it up, and I saw weight gain. I was like, okay, good, and I felt better.
So,
And
sorry,
what
real
I'm,
real quick. When
yeah,
you
go
said you
ahead.
were being too conservative, are you saying on the weight gain side of things you were being too conservative?
Yes. For example, 2 weeks ago, right around the 2.5, 3 week mark post show, my weight gain started to plateau. Like I
Mm,
got up from, I was like 79, 79 and a half on stage at WNBF Worlds around 175 pounds. And I put on a quick, basically 5 pounds, and I was up 2 kilos. And I saw some weigh-ins in the 82 range, and then it dipped all the way down to 81. So I
mm.
saw a couple of times where I'm like, I was losing weight and I was just keeping myself in like the 26 to 2,800 calorie range and keeping 6 to 8,000 steps compared to at maintenance going into the show, I was at 6 to 8,000 steps and at 2,100 calories. So I basically just boosted my calories 6 to 700 after some initial celebratory meals and being around 3,000, 3,500 calories for say 2 to 3 days. So I knew that being around, let's say 3,500 calories for 3 days would expedite the recovery a little bit, but I think I mostly gained back like glycogen, lost tissue. And honestly, when I looked at myself, when I was up to the 80, 81 mark, I still had striated glutes. I wasn't quite as lean, but I looked about as lean as I did in my first show. That's not recovered, right? I put on
Right.
like maybe a kilo of body fat, maybe. And then the other kilo and a half was just other tissue, food bulk, glycogen. Good things to gain back, but not necessarily enough for me to get fully recovered. So now I'm like 2 kilos of body fat higher than that and still quite lean by any objective standard, but I feel a lot better. So now I'm going back to that kind of 2,800 calorie mark once I was being too conservative with my recovery, I jumped to around 3,000 or a little higher than that. And then I went to a Christmas party and I ate like other people at the Christmas party. I had my best imitation of a normal human, right? So yeah, I'm hanging around now 10 pounds over stage weight and I feel a lot better. And I think now I can slow down that rate of weight gain and have a very slow build to say 88 kilos, which is where I think was a good kind of still pretty damn lean. It's like basically 10, 11% over stage weight. And I think that is probably where I'd cap it, which is the leanest I've been and for at least leanest I've attempted to be in the off season. And I want to see if I can make good gains doing that. I plan to get some blood work done early next year to make sure that I'm actually feeling in a way that's reflective of my physiology. Because when you get really habituated, and especially when you're a naturally lean person, I think you can be inadvertently undershooting that. That's not a problem that 99% of people have, and it's only a problem even some of bodybuilders have. But once you really have lived the lifestyle as long as I have it, you can get in that position and you
Yeah.
have to safeguard it.
Yeah. So basically what you're saying there is like you get used to that feeling, and then it's like you may not actually be like in a great spot, even though you feel that way because you got used to it. Same where somebody doesn't get great sleep for long periods of time, and that kind of they just become accustomed to that, and they're like, oh, I get good sleep, but really they don't. And so it sounds like for you then basically what your game plan here is you're trying to gain weight, get back to those to feel good again. And then from there it's just you really just are trying to you have a cap of weight, but you're just the big thing is you just want to slowly see it trend up over time. Just make sure you're not in a deficit there with that. What about maintenance? Are you worried about that at
Hmm.
all? What is that something where you'd be worried about being closer to your maintenance calories, or is that not a thing that you worry about? Yeah, what is
Yeah, I think the main thing is I just don't want to be in a deficit. I'm looking for a weight trend to go up. If I'm 84 now and I have a cap of 88 and we're roughly trying to get to that by the end of 2024, that means I'm gaining around a pound a month or slightly less. So what I'm looking for over the trend of my weigh-ins, and I use an app called Happy Scale, which kind of gives you this rolling average. And I also have a spreadsheet that calculates 1 week, 2 week averages, and a running average that kind of takes the last 2 weeks that moving, it's a moving average with your current weigh-in, is I'm looking for a very slight trend upwards. Ultimately, it self-corrects, and I'm not too concerned if I am at maintenance for a week or two. I think sometimes bodybuilders get a little too focused on if I'm not in a surplus, then I'm clearly not gaining. And that's just not the way it works. We did a study that we recently published in Sports Medicine Open, where we had 17 resistance trained men and women go through an 8 week period of trying to put on muscle mass, training 3 days per week, doing squat, bench, and then a lat, a delt, and a bicep movement every day on the 3 days they trained. And we split them into groups that were either maintenance, a small surplus, or a large surplus intended. And then we analyzed them all together continuously and plotted them like a regression, if you will, to where because even though you assign people these groups, it's a applied study in the real world. Some people are going to be in large surpluses, small, and some people are going to be around maintenance, which is exactly what happened. So we plotted weight gain. So we just, okay, order these people in weight gain. So we've got a plot, just a line. Okay, who gained more weight? And then we plotted against that gains in 1RM strength in the squat, the bench press, and then increases in muscle thickness of the bicep, tricep, and quadriceps. And then also skin fold thickness increases across 8 sites: body fat, hypertrophy, and strength. And we saw no relationship in whether someone was at maintenance or gaining a little bit of weight or gaining a lot of weight over 8 weeks in 1RM strength in the squat or bench press or triceps or quadriceps muscle thickness. And the strongest relationship we saw, which we had what we described as strong evidence, and it explained about half of the variance in this outcome, was between skin fold thickness increases and body weight increases. So the largest predictive variable that was there to determine whether or not you're going to gain more body fat is whether you're gaining more weight, which corroborates what we see in people who are experienced resistance trained individuals, that when they try to bulk, the primary outcome is they gain more body fat. And we only saw a very weak relationship for bicep thickness increase with the surplus, but it was, uh, 1/10 of the strength of evidence compared to body fat, and a quarter of the variance was related to weight gain compared to half of the variance for weight gain compared to fat thickness gain. So unfortunately, what this tells us is that once you're a relatively trained individual, going back to the bulking well is probably not going to go well. It means, based upon other data, which we have, this is not the only study on this, that you probably do want to be in a surplus. There was a meta-regression that showed once you get to around a 500-calorie deficit, on average, it's preventing lean mass gains. So we know this is a continuous variable. So if you can gain muscle at maintenance, great. And if you get a slight benefit from being in a surplus, so long as the training is supporting it, because the thing about the biceps in our study is it actually got the most sets. Like I said, we had, bench and squat, but then we also had back, shoulders, and biceps every day. So between the back work and the biceps, these were the accessories which were actually trained to failure. We had 9 direct sets for biceps and then 9 indirect sets through rows and pull downs. And those sets were all to volitional failure. So we had the way meta-analyses count it and our understanding of volume. If you look at Schoenfeld, Basval, the previous work, is probably somewhere between 10 to 20 sets for the biceps on average, not for you, but for the bell curve of the population is where we see the most robust hypertrophy. And then also we look at the recent meta-regression by Robinson, we see that the closer you get to failure, on average, generally, it seems to produce more hypertrophy. So saying we got 18 sets to failure and looking at the group trend overall in this continuous analysis and seeing that the biceps grew the best out of all the muscle groups and that there was a very slight relationship with the surplus, I think a decent inference to get from our study is that if you are going to try to gain weight to support muscle growth, you really need to make sure that you have a very stimulative environment from your training to support it, or you're primarily just going to gain body fat. And even then, I would say you're going to gain body fat with that muscle. And it's probably going to be more body fat than muscle as an advanced athlete. So you want to ensure a surplus is there, but the size of the surplus is probably less important. And it's probably not worth shortening your runway if you need to get to a certain level of leanness, which competitive bodybuilders do. If I'm going to eventually have to get down to 80 kilos, me getting up to 96 kilos to try to get an additional 50 grams of muscle growth is not a worthwhile trade-off
Yeah.
because then I have to diet for another 5 months, right? Versus if I start prep at, say, 86. So the kind of game plan that I have is take a year to get up to 88 and then run what we call a prep positioning phase after that. So what I'll do is probably mini cut from 88 down to 85. So I'll lose 3 kilos. 85 is quite lean for me. That's what I would look like at 12 weeks out. And then slowly get back up to 86. So I'm in a small surplus and then start prep, say 6 months out, 5 months out, somewhere in there at 85, 86 in that range so that I'm not dieted. I'm eating up into prep, but I'm also at the leanest place I can start without being dieted after having a full year of being in a surplus with only one brief 6-week mini cut. And that's the type of timeline optimization that you need to do at an advanced level to get the most time out of you. And that's if I compete in 2025. If I was to compete in 2026, which is going to be pending the rules, because I've heard good things related to the rule changes in the WNBF. Right now, you have to compete every other year as a pro rule. That might be going away. That's not a promise. It's just rumblings I've heard. Then all of a sudden, I can get up to 90, 91, 92 and run another mini cut. And it just gives me a longer runway. I have more time. And that means I don't need to worry about staying as tight because of the timeline.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're just making sure that you're staying tight. So that way, if you go back to a prep, you don't have to drop as much body fat. So did this study, did it change your mind on any of like weight gain? Is this part of the reason why you're trying to maybe stay a little bit leaner, or did it change your mind? Did it not? Yeah, curious to hear that.
It confirmed some of the evidence that already existed that wasn't as applicable as I would have liked it to have been. Previous research was on the extremes of different populations. So we had a study by Garta and colleagues in 2013. It was on elite athletes who had resistance training experience, but it was primarily via conditioning for their sport. Rowers do a lot of resistance training, but they're not bodybuilders. Track and field athletes do a lot of resistance training, they're not bodybuilders. And then some of the athletes were like alpine skiers or netball or things like that. And their resistance training they're elite athletes, but they're probably what we would consider novice lifters, right? So that was the population. Tells us something about well-trained people. And they split them into groups that were getting dietary counseling from an RD for muscle gain, so a relatively aggressive surplus, compared to them self-selecting their own diet to put on muscle. And not being bodybuilders, being athletes, especially in many power-based sports, they did that very conservatively. And there was actually a 600-calorie difference between the RD-guided elite athletes trying to put on muscle and the self-guided athletes. And what you saw was that there was no significant differences in muscle gain or strength gain between these two groups, but the athletes who are in a 600 calorie surplus, or sorry, 600 calories higher than the other group, put on significantly more body fat. And that was almost exclusively the weight they gained that was more than the other group. And there's only non-significant kind of weak trends suggesting that maybe the additional food helped them. So that was where my initial awareness and just the anecdotes that I see in natural athletes who are experienced trying to bulk, it just doesn't go as well as they wish it did, would indicate that bulks are increasingly less effective as you're close to your genetic ceiling. And you really can't force feed gains, that you can create a really good stimulative environment. And then the farmer, you just need to create the supportive structure for it. So the way I've always said it is that nutrition is permissive to gains. So the times when a bulk is going to work is when it can permit a lot of gains, like your newbie phase. And that's the other extreme end of the research that came out prior to what we did by Rosnick and colleagues. There's a study where they took untrained young males and they gave them like a 2,000 calorie weight gainer on top of their habitual diet. And they gained 7 kilos, I believe, either 6 or 7 kilos. Sorry, no, 3 kilos in 8 weeks, which is almost 7 pounds. So they were putting on almost a pound a week. And most impressively, that 3 kilos of body mass they gained was almost exclusively lean body mass, at
Oh,
least
yeah.
on average. Certainly, some individuals were gaining more or less and of different proportions, but the group mean was 3 kilos gained, so 6.6 pounds ish, 7 pounds ish, over 8 weeks, almost a pound a week, and it being 3 kilos of lean mass from eating 2,000 calories more per day. So that is a study that says you need to bulk, you should bulk, and you're missing out on gains if you do not when you're a young person who is new to lifting. But that's a very different statement than what you should be doing if you have 5, 6, 7 years of experience under your belt and you've already gained your initial 10, 15, 20 pounds, whatever it was for you. So my practical experience combined with the data was what led me to the hypothesis that we were expecting to see better growth in the small and the large surplus group compared to the maintenance group. That was our hypothesis that we tested, but no difference between the two surpluses. But what we actually saw primarily, except for that one biceps finding, was equivalent growth in the maintenance small and large surplus groups, which we analyzed continuously. It's not really best to do a group versus group comparison because of our sample size being limited by COVID. But when we look at the full 17 individuals, which is a sufficient sample size to make inferences in a continuous analysis, we definitely saw that the more weight you gained primarily predicted fat mass gains and only a little bit predicted bicep thickness gains. So yeah, I think it more solidified my belief that once you're past that newbie phase, you have to be very conscious of what's an appropriate surplus. To round it out a little bit, my anecdotes as a coach and as a person is that, so in my personal experience as an athlete, is that you might get a second trip to the well, but you can't be nearly as aggressive, and it needs to be with a program that is individualized to you. So you can find a billion accounts of people running either 5-3-1 or strong lifts or Rippito or whatever, FST7, some random program, good or bad, for hypertrophy or strength. And when they eat a crap ton of food with it, they put on a crap ton of muscle initially. And I think that speaks to the fact that you're so far from your genetic ceiling that a lot of things are going to work so long as it's progressive and even reasonably close to a sufficient volume and reasonably close to a sufficient effort level. If you eat a lot of food, you're going to put on a lot of muscle. After that point, then you need to think about and you need to determine and figure out through trial and error, what does it take for me to grow? For example, I had a relatively successful kind of second trip to the well once I started really upping the volume on my upper body. And then I put on a good another 5 pounds of muscle. Like my stage weight in 2011 was 5 pounds lighter than what it was this time with an improved upper body and in 2019. But I don't know when I put that on because I didn't compete since 2011 to 2019. But I did see some pretty successful periods where I did a bodybuilding focused off season, like in 2018. And I was like, I'm definitely gaining weight. I got pretty heavy. I got up to 216, 215, 98 kilos. And it was the biggest I'd ever looked at that weight and the leanest I'd ever looked at that weight. And I bulked and it looked successful. But I didn't do that with just a random program on the internet or just 531. I didn't go back and try to get that honeymoon phase to repeat. I acknowledged what I did. I experimented and I went, all right, I'm going to spend a couple years figuring out what's the ideal muscle gaining approach for Eric Helms at this stage of my career. And then I will do that while I'm trying to be in a surplus. And now I think I couldn't even repeat that. Like I'm not going to get back up to 98 kilos. I don't think there's any point to it for me. Literally 10 kilos lighter is where I've set the cap if I'm going to compete in 2025. And if I compete in 2026, it'll probably only be 2 or 3 kilos heavier than that. I'm probably not going to get over 200 pounds again in my career. There's really just no point to it as someone who's going to be on stage at maybe if I bring my legs up a lot at 180 instead of 175, right? So yeah, you get definitely one trip to the well, maybe two or three if you can figure out what it takes to move to the intermediate and the advanced stage and you get a really idealized, optimized, individualized system. Or if you go through like a muscle regain period after a layoff or an injury. But I think the take home is that for an advanced lifter, force feeding gains is just not an option. And you're not even really force feeding gains as a novice. You're just permitting the very, very rapid gains that you get as a novice. So yeah, we've got a fair amount of data now, and I think our study just confirms some of those tentative hypotheses we had based upon the data, which was not in the ideal population to really make those conclusions previously.
Yeah, that makes sense. So again, you can't really force feed yourself there. So again, if you're somebody who you're just trying to gain a ton of weight in a short amount of time, probably going to be mostly fat mass in that process. I'm also glad you brought up the bicep aspect of it. I thought that was super interesting where it's like, hey, if you are going to be in the surplus, pushing your training is probably a good idea because I feel like a lot of people, maybe they get too caught up in, hey, what's optimal rate of gain that I need to be at to maximize muscle growth? And then they end up missing the big picture by not what's your training like, right? And that's ultimately going to be the big thing there. I always to tell people like, hey, make sure your training's in a good spot before you overly focus on like the rate of gain that you need to have for muscle growth. And I think this study showed that. So I know you mentioned advanced lifters, hey, we don't want to have this large surplus. Would this be a fair statement though? And again, I think you said this, but people can build muscle at their quote unquote maintenance. Again, is that going to be dependent on your level of advancement there on that? Or what does that look like?
I think it probably has. So certainly it is probably true that being at energy balance or into a surplus is going to be beneficial for putting on muscle. And I don't think it's a minute thing. The reality is that being in a small surplus means being in and out of a small deficit at different times throughout the day, but eventually being in a surplus throughout, over time. It's much like a bank account, right? A large surplus means that you've got a huge paycheck and you're not spending that much money outside of that. But there are times when you look at it throughout the day where you go to Target, you buy some crap, and you haven't gotten a paycheck yet, and your money goes down. That's an acute deficit. So it's not necessarily something that is an on and off switch like we often represent it. Surpluses include periods of time in a deficit, like 4 a.m. when you've been asleep for 5 hours. You're in a deficit. Everybody is, right? And even when you're dieting, if you just had dinner, your body is sensing yourself in the postprandial state. You're in a surplus, right? So it is primarily the net outcome, but building muscle is an ATP intensive, energy requiring process. And if you spend too much time where that's not being fueled, we see that MPS in a deficit, especially a large deficit, is impeded. And when you're lean, we even see higher muscle protein breakdown when you're in a deficit. So mechanistically, we understand that having sufficient energy is required to optimize building muscle. But going over that amount in any acute phase, not really. Having one day where you're eating 1 billion calories isn't going to help you. You just need to make sure that there's not an energy shortfall to short circuit the muscle protein synthetic process. And we also need to make sure that you aren't trying to be too lean because that creates the sensing mechanisms, ultimately starting with your hypothalamus, of you being not in a sufficient long-term energy available state. When someone is higher in body fat, they can sustain small deficits without issue because they can liberate tissue to come up with this energy shortfall to not sacrifice MPS. So I think ultimately, whether you're novice or advanced, just comes down to how quickly can you gain muscle. And then your body fat is basically saying, what is your energy status? So you can combine those two things and you can understand that the ideal scenario is a novice who is high in body fat and eating it in a small surplus or maintenance, and they're probably going to see some rapid muscle gain. And they could probably even do that in a slight deficit even, I would bet. And it probably wouldn't even be that much different. And the less ideal scenario would be an advanced lifter who is in a deficit and very lean. Now we're getting back to the person on stage being in the perfectly wrong environment for building muscle. And then we can finally also see that, okay, if I'm an advanced lifter and I'm rate limited to how much I can gain, if it's going to take me a year to put on a kilo of muscle regardless, then I just need to create an environment that is sufficient to support that. But I'm not going to gain more than a kilo of muscle no matter what I do. So what's the least amount of fat I can gain while supporting that? And it's not being in like a 1 calorie surplus all the time, because it's not really what you're going to be in,
Yeah.
because that means you're going to be in a deficit sometimes. So it requires a certain amount of fat gain, and you want to minimize that. I think the best guess we have at that is probably being in like a 100 to 200 calorie surplus. So, and just accepting the fact that your proportion of fat mass is going to increase with training age. And that's why it's going to have these longer timetables. So when I go from starting 2024 at 84 and getting up to 88, gaining 9 pounds over 12 months, that's a slow bulk, but it's still gaining 9 pounds. And if you go to the grocery store and you look at 9 pounds of chicken breasts and you pack that onto you, like that's a lot of tissue.
You're right.
But unfortunately, it's not going to be 9 pounds of muscle. It'll probably be like 7 pounds of muscle at best, and maybe 2 pounds of tissue. And probably just because I'm training my legs for the first time in 12 years. And there might be a couple 100 grams of upper body tissue, but hopefully in the right places.
Yeah, no, I think you summed that up perfectly. I like the way you explain that. And again, I think a lot of people don't. Also, again, they look at what's the calorie surplus, what's the rate of gain, but they're also, like you said, not looking at like their current body fat levels and how that plays a role as well too. And like you said, somebody that has a lot of muscle, they're leaner, like for them, they probably need to make sure that they're in that smaller calorie surplus. That's going to put them in that better position there on that, versus somebody who has higher body fat levels. They don't have as much muscle on that. And I think, again, just diving a little bit deeper and thinking on it a little bit more is helpful there. Eric, appreciate your time. Is there anything else that you want to hit on with that study, and anywhere where you want to lead the audience to before I let you go?
No, that's it. And that study is open access. You can find it on Sports Medicine Open. And Jeff, if you want to link them to the full study text,
Yep,
that would be amazing. I would
absolutely.
just
Yep.
encourage you guys to check that out in the show notes. And then for everything else, check out 3dmusclejourney.com, or if you really want to nerd out, massresearchreview.com. And then, of course, if you want to hear me on podcasts like this, follow me at Helms 3DMJ on my Instagram.
Yep. And mass office hours, which I've been freaking digging. I think that's freaking awesome that you guys do that. Also, real quick, I know the study's preprint right now. How is that? How
No,
long
it's
does that
fully
take?
published.
It is fully published now. Got you. Okay,
Fully
cool.
published.
Awesome.
If you see the preprint, don't use that one. Use the
Don't
link
use that one.
Sports Medicine Open.
Oh, here it
Yep.
is. Got you. Okay, I see it now. Sweet. Awesome. Cool.
Thanks, buddy.
All right, Eric, appreciate your time as always. We'll get you on here again in a couple months and to check in on your all season and see how that's going. So talk to you soon.
All right, brother. Thank you.